We think of love as a warm feeling and a sense of caring. Many people spend their adult lives asking a quiet, painful question. If I was loved, why didn't it feel like safety? That question isn't an accusation, it's a clue. It points to a gap between what was intended and what was actually received, between emotional warmth and emotional nourishment.
We think of love as a warm feeling and a sense of caring. Now, almost all parents have that for their children. Only very traumatized parents who themselves were totally shut down in childhood lack that oceanic sense of love for their children. But that sense of love, that feeling is not sufficient, because it's not what the parent feels that matters, it's what the child receives. Broad interest is in human development. So what allows people to develop according to their natural tendencies in a healthy way, and what impairs the development, and what are the consequences of that impairment. And they show up in addictions, mental illness, physical illness, personal dysfunctions, relationship problems. So really what I'm interested in is the whole spectrum of human experience and how that is shaped by our interactions with our environment and culture. So anywhere in that range, I'm interested.
Where do we start? What should we ask? What is addiction?
Sure. So I define addiction as manifested in any behavior in which a person finds pleasure or temporary relief and therefore craves it, but then suffers negative consequences and doesn't give it up despite the harm that it causes. So craving relief, pleasure in the short term, harm in the long term, inability or refusal to desist in the long term, that's what an addiction is. And if you understand, that definition does not restrict itself to drugs.
No.
It includes substances, whether legal, like smoking or nicotine or caffeine or alcohol, but or the illicit drugs, but also pornography, sexual roving, gambling, shopping, eating, bulimia, gaming, internet, cell phones, extreme sports, work.
Would laziness be in there too?
Laziness, nobody craves laziness.
Okay.
So again, the definition is if it gives you temporary pleasure, relief, and you crave it. So laziness is more a habit behind which there's all kinds of reasons. But no, it's not an addiction.
Yeah. And what is the role of these addictions?
Well,
vices?
So the medical litany around addiction, that it's a disease of the brain that's largely inherited, which I think is totally nonsense. Some people think it's a manifestation of weakness of will or moral failure, which is also nonsense, that it's a choice that people make. When I talk to anybody, can I make this responsive with you? According to my definition, have you ever had an addictive pattern? I don't care what it was, but yes or no?
Of course, yes.
Okay. Let me ask you this question then. Not what was wrong with the addiction, and I don't care what the addiction even was. What I'm asking is what was good about it. What did you get from it? Temporarily.
Feeling secure and safe, maybe?
Security and safety. Now, who doesn't want security and safety? In other words, that's a human need, actually. In other words, the addict just wants to feel like a human being. And it also means that the addiction wasn't your primary problem. Your primary problem was lack of safety and security, which then goes back to trauma. So my mantra on addiction is don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. What is the underlying pain that the addiction is trying to temporarily soothe? So that's the role of addiction. It's a forlorn, self-destructive attempt to solve the problem of human suffering. That's what it is.
And on my channel, there are thousands of examples of the terribly traumatic experiences that people have had, and especially in their childhoods. Do any of us get through childhood unscathed?
Well, again, unscathed.
Without a traumatic.
Well, so let's differentiate between hurt and pain and trauma. It's impossible to get to human life without being hurt, without experiencing pain. That's just the nature of existence. But that's not what trauma is. Trauma is not hurt or pain. Trauma is a wound that hasn't healed. And yes, it's possible to get through childhood without being wounded. But in this culture, it's almost impossible. That's why the subtitle of my book is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. Because I think this culture wounds people from even before birth onwards. Now, if you look at human history, I mean, prehistory, we evolved in small groups, very communal, very collaborative, very supportive, where the members were very secure that they belonged to the community. Children were surrounded by loving adults. So it's possible to grow up without trauma. It's not possible to grow up without pain, but not everything painful is traumatic. Everything traumatic is painful, but you can have pain without being traumatized by it, depending on the environment and the support that you get.
As a society, are we getting better or worse?
Oh, it's getting worse.
Is it?
I mean, on the one hand, there's more awareness, there's more methods, there's more science, but if you look at from the point of view of human needs of either children or adults, it's getting more and more difficult. Children have the need for absolute security, which you didn't have, or safety, belonging in an attachment relationship. That's not negotiable. Oxygen is not negotiable. Security and safety for a child is not negotiable. It's a need. If we don't get it, we suffer. Children have a need to be able to experience all the emotions that nature gave them and to be able to express them and have those emotions validated and mirrored by the adults in a positive way. Adults have, we all have, adults or children, we all have a need to belong, to be connected with. That's our nature. Now, adults have a need for a sense of belonging. They have a need to be authentic, which means that they could be their true selves without having to follow and mold themselves according to the demands of their environment. And they have a need for meaning and purpose. Now, if you look at any of those needs that I've just outlined, this society is less and less capable of meeting them. Children are less and less safe and secure because the parents are more and more stressed. There's much less sense of belonging because communities, extended families have been eroded significantly. There's increasing isolation and loneliness. And in that context, no, it's getting worse. And, your recent Surgeon General in the States here, Dr. Vivek Murthy, wrote a book about loneliness. And loneliness is an epidemic in society. So is obesity. And all these, both of those are harmful to health. And that's just one example. Here in the United States, where we're speaking, 70% of adults are at least on one medication. And 40% are at least on two. This is in the wealthiest country in the world. This is a toxic culture.
And of course, childhood trauma, in all its forms is damaging to a person. Also, neglect is also a problem.
Well, you're absolutely right. So if you look at, there were studies done in California called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies. They looked at 17,000 adults at their childhood histories and their adult health. And they identified 10 factors that they called adverse childhood experiences. Very famous ACE studies, published all over the world, which is why most doctors never heard about them. But that's a whole other story of what doctors hear and they don't hear. Adverse childhood experiences included physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, violence in the family, a parent being addicted, a parent being mentally ill, a parent dying, a divorce, or a neglect. And each of these added to the risk of addiction exponentially. So by the time a male child had 6 of them, his risk of becoming an injection-using drug addict as an adult was 4,600% greater than that of a male child with no such experience, a 46-fold increase. And that was done in California. To those adverse childhood experiences, we also have to add poverty and racism. Because they can also create extreme harm to the psyche, the brain, and the body.
And can trauma be transferred, I think it's called epigenetically, where it goes from one generation to the next, even almost like in the DNA?
I'm glad you said almost in the DNA.
Most
Not-
conversations
yeah.
about
Because
love,
it's not in the
trauma,
DNA.
and addiction
The
fail not
DNA
because they
doesn't
are wrong,
change,
but
but
because they collapse complex
genes
human
are turned on and
experiences
off by
into
the
simple
environment.
explanations.
so it's
What
like
follows is not about
a
assigning
musical
fault
score,
or offering quick solutions. It is about understanding how
which doesn't
human
tell you how loud
development
or how
actually
softly you
works,
should play the.
how early
that-
experiences shape the
That's the
nervous
epigenetics.
system,
It's which genes
perception,
which
and behavior
genes are turned on
long
and turned
before
off.
conscious
And
choice
so
comes
traits
into
can
play.
be passed on epigenetically. Like we know this in animals. You make the grandfather mice scared, and then you expose, and then the grandchild, which is not exposed to the same scary stimulus, is still afraid. So the fear was passed on epigenetically. But that's only one way. Trauma in general is multi-generational. So that it's not just passed on epigenetically, it's also passed on to the fact that parents who are traumatized and who hasn't resolved or even understood or even been aware of their trauma when they bear children will almost automatically pass their traumas on to their kids through their behaviors and emotional patterns and so on. I mean, I did, and so it's not, nobody's here to be blamed, but trauma is almost always multi-generational.
And is the solution to just learn how to love each other unconditionally as parents?
Well, it depends what we mean by love, because we think of love as a warm feeling and a sense of caring. Now, almost all parents have that for their children. Only very traumatized parents who themselves were totally shut down in childhood lack that oceanic sense of love for their children. But that sense of love, that feeling is not sufficient, because it's not what the parent feels that matters, it's what the child receives. If the parent loves the child but is themselves too traumatized to actually see the child and to attune to the child, then the love doesn't get through. The sense of love gets through, and that's good, but to be truly loved, you have to be seen. And a lot of parents have great difficulty actually seeing their kids for who they are, without their own anxieties and expectations and their own emotional reactions and so on. So that love has to get through. And for that love to really get through, the parent has to be able to attune to the child, and which is to say the parent gets the child's internal experience and knows how to respond to it. And when parents are stressed, as many of them are in this society, they have great difficulty being attuned to the child. So attunement here is the key.
And so maybe teaching us how to be better parents, teaching us how to love ourselves and love each other could possibly help?
Yes, but yes, but it's not a matter of teaching. You can't teach somebody how to love themselves.
You need examples?
It's not like you can teach them mathematics or American history. Self-love is not a skill. It's actually an attribute of the human being, and what we really have to look at is help people remove the blocks towards self-love. And one of the impacts of trauma, you're quite right to talk about self-love, because one of the greatest impacts of trauma is that people have a deep, abiding sense of shame about themselves, and they're highly judgmental of themselves. And so the way towards self-love is to remove the blocks to it, rather than here's how you do it. And that's a lifelong process, let me tell you.
Yeah. And even stress during pregnancy or early childhood can shape someone's patterns?
Well, there was an article from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child 13 years ago now, published in the Journal of Pediatrics. And it's on early childhood development. It's a classic article. And it said that the process of brain development begins before birth and continues into adulthood, and establishes either a fragile or a robust framework for all health, learning, behavior. The fact is, we know now from multiple studies that when women are stressed during pregnancy, the stress hormones that she then generates from her adrenal gland go through to the infant with a negative impact on the infant's brain development. And women who are severely depressed or stressed during pregnancy, their children are much more likely to have developmental problems, mental health issues a few years later. So I mean, that's just not even controversial. So when people talk to me about how do you prevent addiction, and everybody thinks you prevent addiction by going to schools and telling kids how bad addictions are. Useless. Because the kids who are listening to adults are not at risk, and the kids who are at risk are not listening to adults. The prevention of addiction needs to begin at, or any mental health issue, needs to begin at the first prenatal visit. So, as a medical doctor, I delivered a lot of babies, about 1,000 in 20 years. And I was well trained to look after the physical needs, the physical requirements, checking the blood pressure, the weight, the diet, the blood sugar levels, and so on. Nobody ever told me to ask the woman, how are you feeling emotionally? How is your relationship? How much calmness or how much stress do you feel? Who do you ask for help when you need it? Those questions are not taught to medical students. And yet, the woman's emotional states do have an impact already on the infant. So that it begins really early.
Do you believe any child escapes trauma completely?
Yeah, I do. Some, but it's a minority.
What does it look like as an adult?
An adult who is comfortable with who they are, who's in touch with their authentic self, which means with their gut feelings, their body, and their gut and their heart, who respects their own individuality and the individuality of others, and can interact with people in a non-defensive, non-reactive way, and can respond to the present situation based on the needs of the present, not some programming from the past. And by the way, speaking of trauma, when I was working in the downtown east side of Vancouver, in 12 years, I didn't have a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. Not one.
Really?
And all the men had been either neglected or abused, or, this is the extreme. But in this society, there's such a punitive attitude towards people who are drug addicted. And there's two fundamental flaws about that. One is we're blaming people for having been hurt and being desperate to escape from their pain. Number one. Number two, those people who are drug addicted are no different from the rest of us. When I was working with these people, I saw myself in them. I had my own addictive behaviors. I manipulated and I lied about them, and my addictive behaviors had an impact on my family and even on my work. Only thing is, it wasn't to drugs. So I didn't face any medical consequences or legal consequences. But they were no different from me in the sense of the desperation to escape from the discomfort that they were experiencing.
You were a workaholic.
I was a workaholic, and I was also a significant shopping addiction. So I shopped relentlessly. I spent thousands of dollars in an afternoon on compact discs, and by the evening I was back in the store.
Classical music?
Sorry?
Classical music?
Classical music, yeah. But it wasn't the music that I was addicted to. It was the shopping. I had to have that hit. And you always think when you're addicted that just one more will do it. If I just get this particular piece of item or disc, I'll be complete. An hour later, you're running back to the store again. Because every addict looks for a quick hit of dopamine. And dopamine is the brain chemical that makes us feel alive and vital and present and motivated. And of course, that dopamine hit is very temporary. So if you look at the brain scans of pornography addicts, there's the surges of dopamine. It's not the pornography they're addicted to, it's the dopamine. They just happen to get the release of dopamine through the pornography. The gambler is the same thing. The gambler is not after money, because typically a gambler wins a lot of money in the slot machine in the evening. By the morning, he's losing again. He's after the excitement, the anticipation. The sex addict is not after sex as such, because if they were, the solution to sex addiction was very simple. Just marry another sex addict. Then you can have all the sex you want for the rest of your life. No, it's the conquest, it's the hunt, it's the excitement, it's that dopamine surge. And everybody who's addicted, that's what they're addicted to. And so why are we blaming these people who are using drugs?
Why do so many people relapse, even after years of being sober and doing well?
That again has to do with the addicted brain. So what we have to understand here is that the human brain develops in interaction with the environment. It's not genetically determined. There's 20,000 genes or so in the human organism. About 10,000 are dedicated to the central nervous system in the brain. And the brain has billions and trillions of connections. There's not enough genes to program our brains. So the second sentence from that Harvard article that I cited is that the interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain. So it's not the genes, it's the action of the environment on the genes, shapes the circuitry of the developing brain, and is significantly influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early years. Now, the circuitry that doesn't develop in the addict really well is the opiate endorphin circuitry, our internal opiates. That's why they want to do morphine. And endorphins are essential for pain relief, for pleasure and reward, and for love. And so I asked a patient of mine in the downtown east side once, a 27-year-old woman, she had HIV. And I asked her, what does the heroin do for you? And she said, first time I did heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug. She was just looking for love because her own circuitry had not developed because of the childhood trauma. Then the dopamine circuitry, which is the motivation, seeking, vitality circuitry, that doesn't develop. And stress regulation circuitry also doesn't develop. And stress regulation means that when something happens, I respond proportionately to what's going on in the present moment. But when the stress regulation doesn't develop properly, I don't know how to regulate my stresses. I don't know how to calm myself down after a stressful incident. And so when you talk to people who relapse, over and over again, you ask them, well, what happened just before you relapsed? Usually something stressful happened that they didn't know how to cope with, and then they go back to the known entity, which is the addiction that'll soothe their stress. like it might soothe your insecurity and lack of safety temporarily. So usually relapse is a response to stress, and that's the whole problem with the addiction treatment industry and even the 12-step movement. As much as I admire and support the 12 steps, but they're missing the trauma piece. So somebody can, and there's a distinction between abstinence and sobriety. Abstinence means you're not using something. That's great, nothing wrong with it. But sobriety means that you can actually soberly consider your situation. So a lot of people give up the substance without becoming sober. And that means when they get stressed, they go for the tried and true.
And what role does shame play in keeping people trapped in these cycles of addiction?
Shame is huge. And that's one of the greatest impacts of trauma, is a deep sense of shame about the self. And people think that shame is a response to what they did or they didn't do. No. They think they're ashamed of themselves because they're addicted. Actually, it goes the other way around. The shame came long before the addiction. And the shame has all kinds of sources, but again, it has to do with early trauma, early neglect, or early disconnection. If a child is suffering, either because bad things are being done to them, or because they're not getting their needs met in a positive sense, the child can make two assumptions unconsciously. One is, the world is screwed, my parents are incompetent or cruel, here I am. The other assumption is, these bad things are happening to me because there's something wrong with me fundamentally, and if I work hard enough, maybe I can fix it. Now, which belief do you think is more acceptable to the child? It's obviously the second one. At least it gives them some sense. So even the shame comes along as a kind of adaptation, but it's debilitating. Shame is the worst state. When you're shamed, you just don't want to be here. You want to sink into the ground, and you want to even further isolate yourself.
Yeah, shame is a horrible emotion.
It's the worst state there is. It's the worst state there is, and it's very common. And then we try all these ways to escape from the shame by projecting a self-image that we want to identify with, by pleasing others so they won't reject us, by suppressing our needs. One of the great difficulties people have is just asking for help.
Seen through this lens, addiction is not a malfunction of character or morality, but an attempt at regulation. It is the nervous system reaching for relief where it can find it. The question, then, is not why someone continues a harmful behavior, but what need was never met that made the behavior necessary in the first place. This is where so much confusion and unnecessary guilt lives. Love is not a moral achievement, it's a relational process. A child's nervous system doesn't organize around a parent's intention, but around consistency, attunement, and felt safety. When those signals are missing, even in loving homes, the child doesn't experience rejection, they experience uncertainty. And uncertainty over time becomes the ground where shame and self-blame quietly
no
grow.
infant is born
At the
not
center
knowing
of
how
this
to ask for
discussion is
help.
a subtle but essential
That's all they
distinction.
do.
Love is
crying.
not defined
But at
by
a
how
certain point we
strongly it is
learn
felt,
that
but by how reliably it is
our
received.
asking for help invites a negative
Human beings,
response from our
especially
caregivers.
children, do not organize
Then we
themselves
get
around
ashamed
intention
of
or
even
belief. They
asking
organize
for
around
help.
patterns of response.
I say this a lot of
When
the
those
time, but
patterns are inconsistent
have you
or
seen this book
overwhelming,
by this British guy called Charlie
adaptation,
McKeesey
not
called The Boy,
pathology,
the Mole, the Horse,
follows.
and the Fox?
No.
Okay, it's one of these children's books that are for adults. That is for adults. It's mostly illustrations. He's a wonderful illustrator. The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. It's an international bestseller. Sold millions of copies. Amongst these four friends, the horse is the wisest one. And at some point, they ask the horse, "What's the most courageous thing you ever said?" And the horse says, "Help." Now, people are ashamed of themselves. They don't even ask for help. So shame is debilitating.
Can someone truly heal without first addressing their underlying trauma?
Can people heal without addressing the trauma? Well, literally the meaning of the word trauma comes from the Greek. It means a wound. So can people heal without healing the wound? No, they can't. They can put on, they can behave the right way, they can present the right way, but are they healed underneath? No, they're not. I think the wound has to be, and the beauty of it is, in my understanding, and not just my understanding of astute colleagues, is that trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is the wound that you sustained. Trauma is what you made it mean. Trauma is the shame. Trauma is the self-rejection. Trauma is the ongoing pain. So trauma is a wound that hasn't healed, which is a good thing. Because if trauma is a wound that hasn't healed, then you can heal it in the present. If the trauma was what happened to you all those years ago, it's gone, finished. It'll never not have happened. But trauma, being a wound, yes, anybody can be healed at any stage of life, as long as there's consciousness.
If trauma is understood not as what happened, but as what remained unresolved, then healing becomes possible at any stage of life. This reframes responsibility without blame. It allows parents, children, and even entire cultures to be seen not as broken, but as shaped by stress, by disconnection, and by environments that often ask more of human beings than their nervous systems can bear.